Prince William has just now issued a ruthless 48-hour ultimatum directly aimed at Camilla. The demand was so serious, so direct, that even King Charles needed to get involved. But what exactly did William demand in just 48 hours, and why did he choose Camilla specifically? Today, I am going to answer all of those questions, but if you thought the British royal family had finally found its peace, think again. Because what is emerging from inside palace walls right now suggests that the calm we have been seeing on the surface is anything but real. According to royal insiders and investigative sources close to the family, Prince William issued what can only be described as a ruthless 48-hour ultimatum to Camilla, Queen Consort. And the nature of that ultimatum, it concerned her role, her reach, and her influence over King Charles, at a moment when William believes the monarchy cannot afford any more instability. Think about that for a moment. The future King of England, a man known for his carefully controlled public image, reportedly felt so strongly about Camilla's behavior and influence that he gave her a hard deadline, 48 hours. Sources close to William suggest this was not an impulsive decision. This had been building for months. What most people don't know is that the tension between William and Camilla has never truly been about personality clashes alone. It runs deeper than that. It concerns the direction of the monarchy itself. William has spent years carefully constructing a vision for what the crown should look like in the modern era. Leaner, more accountable, more transparent. But then Camilla's growing influence over Charles began to pull in what insiders describe as a very different direction. Sources say William became increasingly alarmed at the number of decisions being made at the senior royal level that bore Camilla's fingerprints, decisions about staffing, about public appearances, and most critically, about who holds access to the king. What people don't realize is that access to the king is everything inside the palace. It determines who gets resources, who gets support, who gets heard. And according to royal watchers who have tracked the internal dynamics of the palace for years, Camilla had quietly positioned herself as the gatekeeper to Charles in a way that even senior aides found remarkable. William reportedly saw this not just as a personal affront, but as a structural problem, a problem that needed to be solved before it became permanent. And so the ultimatum came. 48 hours to step back, 48 hours to agree to a new understanding of boundaries, 48 hours to decide what kind of relationship she wanted to have with the future king. What happened next would reveal just how much tension had been silently accumulating inside the House of Windsor. But to truly understand why William reached this point, you have to go back, way back, because this conflict did not begin with a single argument or a single decision. It began with a funeral, a wedding, and 20 years of quiet resentment. Now, just when you think you understand the William and Camilla conflict, the history reveals something far more interesting. Most people assume the tension between Prince William and Camilla Parker Bowles began with Diana, and they are not entirely wrong. But what is rarely discussed is how that tension evolved, and how it transformed from grief into something far more strategic and political over the decades that followed. When Diana died in 1997, William was 15 years old. He was a boy who had just lost his mother in the most public and traumatic way imaginable, and the woman who had been at the center of his parents' catastrophic marriage was still very much in his father's life. What most people don't know is that in the years immediately following Diana's death, William reportedly made it quietly but unmistakably clear to those around him that he was not ready to accept Camilla. Not yet, perhaps not ever. Royal insiders from that period have described a young William who was fiercely protective of his mother's memory and deeply wary of the woman he associated with destroying his family. But then something unexpected happened. Time passed, and William, to his credit, made a decision that many described as genuinely mature. He chose to accept Camilla, not warmly, not enthusiastically, but practically. He understood that his father loved her. he understood that fighting it would damage his relationship with Charles irreparably. And so, ahead of Charles and Camilla's wedding in April 2005, William stood alongside his father and gave the union his public blessing. What nobody talked about at the time was the private condition that reportedly came with that acceptance. Sources close to the family suggest William made it clear, quietly but firmly, that Camilla's role was to be a supportive partner to Charles. Nothing more, nothing less. She was not to position herself as a replacement for Diana in any symbolic or institutional sense, and for a period that understanding held, but then Charles became king in September 2022, following the death of Queen Elizabeth II, and everything changed, because the moment Charles ascended to the throne, Camilla's position was transformed overnight. She was no longer simply the woman Charles loved, she was queen consort. She had staff, resources, a platform, and crucially, unprecedented proximity to the most powerful position in the British establishment. What royal insiders began noticing almost immediately was that Camilla took to this new role with a confidence and assertiveness that surprised even those who knew her well. She was no longer quietly supportive. She was actively shaping decisions. She was building alliances. She was by all accounts thriving, and William was watching every single move, because the Camilla, who had agreed to play a background role, was beginning to look very different from the Camilla who now walked the corridors of power as queen. That gap between expectation and reality is where the conflict truly began. But here is what makes this story truly fascinating, because William's frustration with Camilla is not simply personal, it is ideological. To understand why William issued that ultimatum, you first have to understand what he is trying to build. Prince William has spent the better part of a decade quietly but deliberately constructing a vision for a 21st century monarchy, a monarchy that is leaner, more accountable, more connected to ordinary people, and ruthlessly focused on long-term survival. What most people don't realize is that William has been more strategic about the future of the crown than almost any royal of his generation. He has studied the institutions that have collapsed. He has studied the monarchies across Europe that have faded into irrelevance. And he has concluded, according to sources close to his inner circle, that the British monarchy's greatest threat is not republicanism from the outside. It is dysfunction from the inside. This is a man who watched his parents' marriage implode on the world stage, who watched his brother and sister-in-law wage a very public war against the institution he is set to lead, who watched the monarchy's approval ratings fluctuate wildly depending on the behavior of individual family members. And William's response to all of that is not emotional. It is clinical. Sources describe a future king who approaches the monarchy the way a CEO approaches a struggling but salvageable company. Cut what doesn't work, protect the core, control the narrative. What people don't know is that William has reportedly been in quiet discussions with a small number of trusted advisors about what a slimmed-down monarchy looks like in practical terms. Fewer working royals, fewer publicly funded positions, a tighter, more disciplined inner circle, and a much clearer line between those who hold institutional power and those who are simply family members of the king. Now consider where Camilla sits in that vision. She is queen consort. She is constitutionally significant, but she is not in the line of succession. She will never be William's queen, and yet, according to insiders, she has accumulated a level of soft power and institutional influence that William believes is disproportionate and potentially damaging to the structured monarchy he is trying to build. There is also something else that is rarely reported. William is said to be deeply concerned about the precedent Camilla's influence sets, because if a queen consort can accumulate this much behind-the-scenes power during Charles's reign, what does that mean for Catherine's role when William eventually becomes king? This is not just about Camilla, it is about the architecture of power itself. And William, more than almost anyone in the royal family, understands that the architecture you allow today becomes the constraint you inherit tomorrow. That is why the ultimatum was not just personal, it was structural, it was strategic, and it was, in William's view, necessary. But just when you think you have Camilla figured out, she surprises everyone, because the story of how Camilla went from the most unpopular woman in Britain to one of the most strategic, powerful figures inside the palace is one of the most remarkable political transformations in modern royal history. Cast your mind back to 2005. When Charles and Camilla married, the public mood was hostile. Polls at the time showed that a significant portion of the British public did not want Camilla to become queen. The Church of England had concerns. Several Commonwealth nations were openly sceptical, and within the palace itself, there were courtiers who privately doubted whether the marriage would survive the weight of public disapproval. But Camilla did something nobody predicted. She played the long game. While the media waited for her to make a mistake, she stayed quiet. While critics expected her to overreach, she pulled back. She attended the right events. She said the right things. She charmed the right people. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, public opinion began to shift. What most people don't know is that Camilla's rehabilitation was not accidental. According to royal insiders, it was carefully managed, and Camilla herself was far more involved in its orchestration than she ever publicly acknowledged. She cultivated relationships with key figures in the British press. She identified causes, literacy, domestic abuse awareness, osteoporosis, that were both genuinely important to her and strategically valuable in terms of public perception. And she understood, perhaps better than anyone in the royal family at the time, that likability is built slowly and lost quickly. By the time Queen Elizabeth II died in September 22, Camilla had already secured something extraordinary, a public endorsement from the Queen herself. In her Platinum Jubilee message earlier that year, Elizabeth had expressed her sincere wish that Camilla would be known as Queen Consort when Charles ascended the throne. That single sentence rewrote Camilla's destiny. But then there is the layer that goes beyond public image, because inside the palace, Camilla had been building something equally significant, a network. Sources describe a Queen Consort who has developed remarkably strong relationships with senior members of Charles's household staff, relationships that give her visibility into the king's schedule, his mood, and his priorities in ways that go well beyond what most consorts have historically enjoyed. She is not managing Charles, but she is, by all accounts, deeply embedded in the daily rhythm of his life and his reign, and that embeddedness is precisely what William finds troubling, because a king who is deeply emotionally reliant on his queen consort is a king whose decisions are inevitably shaped by her presence. Camilla has not seized power, but she has positioned herself so close to it that the distinction, in William's view, has become dangerously blurred, and that is what made the 48-hour ultimatum feel, to those who knew about it, not just inevitable, but overdue. Now this is the part of the story that very few people know in full. According to sources close to the situation, William's ultimatum to Camilla was delivered not in a single dramatic confrontation, but through a chain of trusted intermediaries, senior aides who moved between the households of the Prince of Wales and the King. This is how the most serious conversations inside the palace are handled, not face to face, not in writing, through people who carry messages that cannot be traced, recorded or leaked. But the substance of the message, according to those who have pieced it together from multiple sources, was unambiguous. William reportedly demanded that Camilla pull back from her involvement in a specific set of decisions that he believed fell outside the appropriate remit of the Queen Consort. These were not ceremonial decisions. They concerned the king's public engagement schedule, the management of certain senior household appointments, and most critically, the flow of information between Charles's office and William's own household. What most people don't know is that William had become increasingly convinced that information he shared privately with his father was being filtered, summarized, or reframed before Charles received it, not fabricated, but shaped. And in the ultra-sensitive ecosystem of palace politics, Shaping information is a form of power that William could not ignore. The 48-hour window was not arbitrary. Sources suggest it was tied to a specific upcoming decision believed to be related to a senior appointment within the royal household that William felt needed to be made without Camilla's influence. He wanted an answer before that decision was finalized. He wanted a commitment, and he wanted it fast. But then the 48-hour window passed, and what happened next was not the clean resolution William had demanded. Instead, according to insiders, the response that came back was careful, measured, and in William's view, deliberately evasive. Camilla did not refuse, but she did not fully agree either. The response, relayed through the same chain of intermediaries, reportedly acknowledged William's concerns in general terms, while stopping well short of committing to the specific boundaries he had outlined. It was, in the language of palace diplomacy, a non-answer dressed as a concession, and William understood exactly what it was. What is particularly striking, and what has not been widely reported, is that Charles was fully aware of the ultimatum as it unfolded. He was not kept in the dark, he was briefed, and yet he did not intervene. He did not call William, he did not call Camilla, he waited. And that silence from the king, a man caught between his heir and his wife, would prove to be the most revealing moment of the entire episode. But here is where the story becomes not just political, but deeply painful and even embarrassing, because at the center of this conflict sits a 76-year-old king who has spent the majority of his adult life being pulled in opposing directions by the people he loves most. Charles III is not a weak man, but he is a man for whom emotional harmony has always been both a deep personal need and a persistent political vulnerability. Those who know him well describe a king who finds direct confrontation genuinely distressing, not because he lacks conviction, but because he has spent decades inside an institution that taught him to manage conflict through protocol and distance rather than through honest conversation. And now, the two most important people in his personal life were in direct conflict: his son, his wife. What most people don't realize is that Charles's relationship with William has been quietly strained for longer than most royal watchers acknowledge. The tension did not begin with Camilla. It began with Charles's parenting style, or more accurately, what William experienced as its absence during the most formative years of his life. Insiders describe a William who loves his father deeply, but has never fully forgiven him for the choices Charles made during his marriage to Diana. Choices that William believes caused his mother irreparable harm. That unresolved grief sits underneath every disagreement between father and son. But then there is Charles's relationship with Camilla, which is by all serious accounts the most genuinely loving relationship of his life. People who have observed them together over many years describe a couple who are remarkably well matched. She steadies him, she makes him laugh. She is, according to those close to the king, the emotional anchor of his daily life in a way that no other relationship has ever been. Which means that when William issued his ultimatum, Charles faced an impossible calculation: side with his son, and signal to Camilla that her role has limits he is prepared to enforce, or side with his wife and deepen the fracture with the man who will one day inherit everything Charles has built. What insiders suggest Charles ultimately chose was neither. He chose distance. He chose to allow the situation to exist without resolving it, in the hope, perhaps, that time and diplomacy would smooth what direct intervention might shatter. But what most people don't know is that this is not the first time Charles has responded to a crisis between William and Camilla in exactly this way. There is a pattern here, a pattern of hoping that if he does not choose, the choice will make itself. And it is precisely that pattern, that profound reluctance to act, that has allowed the tension between William and Camilla to grow from a quiet simmer into something that now requires a 48-hour ultimatum to address. The question is whether Charles's silence this time will cost him more than he can afford. So where does this leave the British monarchy, and what does it tell us about the times ahead? because this story is not finished, not even close. What royal experts who have tracked the Windsor family for decades are now watching very carefully is whether the ultimatum and Camilla's non-answer marks a permanent shift in the relationship between William and the current royal household, because if it does, the implications are significant. A Prince of Wales who does not trust the Queen Consort is a future king who will arrive on the throne already carrying an unresolved war inside his own family. And history tells us that unresolved wars inside royal families do not stay quiet. They surface in decisions, in appointments, in the slow, deliberate reshaping of an institution by a new monarch who remembers exactly what was done and who did it. What most people don't know is that William has already begun laying the groundwork for a household structure that when he eventually becomes king will look very different from what exists today. Fewer inherited staff, fewer inherited allegiances, a clean slate as much as any monarchy ever gets one. But then there is Camilla's position to consider. She is Queen Consort now. She will remain so for as long as Charles reigns, and she has proven, repeatedly and remarkably, that she is far more resilient and far more politically astute than anyone gave her credit for. The 48-hour ultimatum did not break her, it did not even visibly rattle her, and that, perhaps more than anything else, is what William now has to reckon with. He is dealing with someone who has survived far worse than an ultimatum. The coming years will reveal whether William's strategic vision for the monarchy is strong enough to outlast Camilla's grip on the present one. But one thing is certain, the battle for the future of the British crown is already underway, and it is being fought right now, quietly, ruthlessly, and behind closed doors. So here is what I know. William issued a direct, time-limited ultimatum to Camilla. Camilla did not fully comply. Charles chose silence over resolution, and the tension at the heart of the British monarchy is not fading, it is hardening. Now we want to hear from you. Was William right to issue this ultimatum, or did he overstep? Is Camilla's influence inside the palace a genuine threat to the institution, or is William simply trying to control something that is not his to control yet? And what does Charles's silence tell us about the kind of king he truly is? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because this conversation is far from over.